Hi, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. Today, April and I are going to show you how to set up a hand plane. So maybe you went out and you bought an antique plane, or you went out and bought a fancy new one. The setup process, or the tuning process, is going to be pretty similar. You're going to have a lot more work though with the antique plane getting it ready for actual use though. On the antique planes, they've probably been sitting around for a while, so the bottom of the sole of the plane is probably not flat anymore. So one of the major things you're going to have to do is get the sole flat. It's actually, the process is pretty easy. It's just really boring and tedious. Any flat surface you have, throw some sandpaper on it, so like a table saw or a jointer bed or a planer bed or whatever, put some sandpaper on there and just rub the plane back and forth on the sandpaper until you get a nice flat surface. The other thing on the older planes is the blade. If it's an antique and it wasn't taken care of, the blade is probably in a really bad shape. So you're probably going to have to resharpen that and actually probably grind it back to establish a new angle on it. So grinding it back, pretty easy. Just get the rough angle in, and then you're going to follow the same sharpening process that you would for anything else in your shop, chisel or any other like newer plane iron. Same exact process. All this is a fancy holder for a chisel. That's all this is. So the setup process for a smoothing plane or like a smaller, more delicate cut and like a roughing cut is a little bit different, because with a roughing cut, you can be a lot more aggressive with things, and the surface quality doesn't matter quite as much as more of a finishing plane. So this one I'm setting up here is number 4. I'm going to set up more for a smoothing cut, or just a more general, not as rough kind of setup. So the most important part of this whole plane actually working well is having a really ridiculously sharp blade, because if it's not going to cut well. You're going to be pretty frustrated. So most of the time, if you have a plane that's not cutting well, it's probably the blade. It's not really the setup. So although we'll look at a bunch of things you can like touch on here to make it cut better, it's not going to do anything for you if the blade's not sharp. So one of the things you can do for the antique planes is you can buy a modern upgraded blade. So this is a blade that is like a modern steel. You can see how much thicker it is compared to the original antique one. Better.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a lot thicker, which means it's going to chatter less, so you should get a smoother cut. And also on here I have a modern chip breaker as well. So you can see how much thicker that is compared to the old one. And the style is a little different too. This relies more on this big spring kind of mechanism through here, whereas this one isn't as nearly as springy looking because it's so thick. All right. So assuming you have a sharp blade, you're going to set the chip breaker onto the blade. And the distance you set the chip breaker back from the edge is going to kind of dictate the smoothness of the cut. So if you're doing like a roughing cut and you want to get those big chips out of there as fast as possible, you can set it back pretty far, but the closer to the edge you can get this thing, the better for any kind of smoothing or fine cut. So I'm going to set this to maybe, I don't know what that is. We'll say it's like nothing. Oh,
Just because it gives it more stability, or?
Yeah, it causes the chip to come off the blade sooner in the cut, which would result in a smoother cut. And if you're going against the grain or some difficult grain, it would actually reduce the amount of tear out, because the fibers are supported more throughout the cut. And the same thing here. I have it set for a little bit of a wider opening, but on the mouth here, if you can get the blade closer to the front here, that way as you're planing, the fibers are supported, and then the distance they come off, there's like floating in free air before they get cut, is reduced, so that it actually cuts the wood instead of tearing it off.
Yeah.
Not as big of a deal if you get something where you can get nice straight grain on it, but if you have any kind of a knot in there or some kind of deviation in the grain, that's going to save you a lot of time. And to do that, you would adjust this piece here, which is called the frog, which is the goofiest name ever for a piece of steel. But this thing comes in and out this way, so as you move it forward, it puts the blade point closer to the end of the mouth. So you can see here I have it pretty wide. I've got maybe a little over a 1/16 there. But if you want to do like a really smooth cut, I think that one's pretty wide too, but you can move it even closer to that. So basically, if you're trying to do a smoothing cut, you want that opening to be only as wide as the thickness of the shaving you're trying to cut.
Okay.
But this is more of a general purpose tool at this point. So I just drop it in there, and then I put the lever cap on, like that, and snap it down. Now the next thing you want to do is set the angle of the blade. So when the blade's in there, it could be at some kind of weird angle. So that's pretty easy to do on this plane. There's just an adjustment lever back here, and you can see as I'm pushing that, it's actually swinging that blade to the left and the right.
It's got a tail rudder.
It does have a rudder, exactly. So to do that, it's pretty simple. I'll just bring the blade so that's outside of the plane a little bit.
Oh yeah, you can really see it
And then
then.
you can look straight down there and you can adjust this little rudder thing, as you call it, so that the blade is protruding the same amount on the left and the right. And it's actually really easy to eyeball this. So I'd say that looks pretty close. You just push the rudder towards the high side, and that brings it down. And now you can back the blade off. And you can set your depth. So you can do it a couple ways. You can either eyeball that, or you can do it with a piece of wood, which is what I prefer to do, which we can hop over that
I
side.
like test pieces.
Exactly. Just a little test piece. And what I'll do is, I'll show you, we'll set the blade back into the body, then I'll start advancing the blade until it starts cutting, and until I get to the point where it's cutting the thickness of the shaving that I want. All right, so we're going to do a few test passes here, and we'll slowly advance the blade until it starts picking up a shaving. You can see it's just starting to grab a little bit. There, so I grab on that side, but it's not grabbing on this side. So one of the things you can do there is be able to tell that, oh, it's probably protruding further on this side, so I'll just knock it back a little bit with the rudder, with the adjustment lever. More. I'm starting to get more towards the middle. And now I'm not cutting at all, so that means that it's pulled this side in further now, so I can drop the blade down a little bit more. There you go. That's a dull plane.
How do you know it's not a piece of wood that's unlevel?
The wood was actually pretty flat to begin with, and it wouldn't be that hard to push. So you see as I'm coming through, this is really hard to push, and it's not actually cutting. It's kind of just more scraping on the surface. So if I swap in my actual sharp blade that I've been using, this one here, and then try to make the cut, and then reset the whole
the whole bit.
the whole bit again. So you can see because the blade's actually like a different length and all that stuff. And I gotta retract the blade again. So I'll pull that back in. Actually, the lateral adjustment or the rudder adjustment is pretty close to the same as the other one, so that's pretty good. And you can see now that I have this thicker blade in here, you can see how much closer the blade is to the top of the throat there. So it's actually set up more for a smoothing cut now compared to that big gap we had before. So let's see here, a little more. All right, so same thing again. The nice thing about this is like you set it once and you put it on the shelf, and you don't have to set it again until you have to sharpen. I really pull that thing up in there. So again, a little off the left side, so I'll just nudge this over just a tiny little bit. Try again. So we're starting to get some pretty fine shavings, so if you wanted to have a smoothing plane, that's probably good. If you want to do a little more coarse stuff, you might drop the blade down a little further and have that be the depth that you have it set to. But you can see, same plane, different blade. The blade here is moderately sharp compared to that one. So it makes a huge difference. You want to try?
Sure. You hold it at an angle.
Yeah, I hold at a skew angle. It makes it easier to push through.
And are you pulling with your front hand, or are you just pushing?
I'm pushing.
Back?
The front hand. So on the plane here, since this is actually really short bore, it's a good learning experience because it's so dang short. So you want to keep the pressure on the blade the whole time, or where the blade is. So as you're coming on, you're putting a lot of downward pressure here to keep it from tipping back. And then as you get to maybe like here, pressure's off the front, pressure's on the back. So as you come through, you end up doing like that kind of thing.
And putting a divot in.
Yep. So you can see with hand planes, you kind of have two major like pathways, but the actual tuning process is the same. If you get the antique plane, you can make it cut as good as a modern new plane. It's going to take you a little bit more work to get it fixed up and ready to go before you start getting the blade set and all that stuff. And there's also the middle of the road where you get the upgraded blade in the older plane. But More money, more work, less work, more money.
It's always a trade-off.
Life.